Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. Today's guest is an objectivist and he's an attorney, and he's had some very interesting experiences in the criminal justice system, and he's here to talk about them with us today. Nicholas Provenzo, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. My pleasure.
Okay, so you introduced yourself to me as both an objectivist and an attorney. So can you tell us a little bit about both? For instance, what attracted you to objectivism, and tell us about the type of law that you practice?
Oh, how I got into Objectivist is actually a funny story. So I was fresh out of the Marine Corps in the mid '90s, and I was at college at George Washington University, and I was always interested in politics, so started a political group. College Republicans did all that. I'm up on a debate, and we're debating drug legalization, and I'm taking the standard conservative position: drugs are bad. You don't want to do drugs. Well, my counterpart is this very erudite objectivist. His name's John Offer. We're good friends to this day. John
He's a
demolished.
Facebook friend of mine, I think.
Yeah. You probably know John. John's a great guy. He demolishes me. Like, it's humiliating. and Mr. Provenzo, what are individual rights? And when is one man's need a mortgage on life? All this good stuff, right? Just spoilerplate objectivism, but John's very articulate. And I'm mortified because I want to go in there. I want to know what I'm talking about, and I thought I knew what I was talking about. And I just realized that there was a huge glaring contradiction, because on one hand, I certainly identified with John's argument for freedom. We should be self-sovereign. We should be captains of our own fate, as long as we don't violate the rights of others. And yet here I was calling for this draconian
massive
of human liberty. One doesn't have to support drug abuse. One doesn't have to support the scourge of addiction to still say someone should be able to choose.
Sure.
Just like having a drink of alcohol, and I was so fascinated by the fact that John so readily defeated me. I'm like, how did he do that? What does he know? And we ended up sharing office space. So, all the student groups were on one floor of the student center, and they put us in the same room because they're like, well, you're right of center, you live together, and argue it out. And just after weeks and months of conversations, I discovered Ayn Rand with some depth, because I'd read her earlier. I'd read her before I started school, just one article, and I was not a fan. It was on one of her essays on sacrifice, and I was writing a paper for it was just like summer school, and what was I couldn't reconcile her view of sacrifice and selfishness with Medal of Honor recipients. And again, fresh out of the Marine Corps, Medal of Honor recipient, they're jumping on grenades for their brother.
Sure.
That's the most selfless thing someone could do. And then you have this woman who says, well, you should act on your own rational self-interest and not sacrifice yourself. And so I wasn't intellectually mature enough at that point to reconcile the contradiction and see where she was coming from. So it was this extended deep dive by my relationship with, ended up a whole group of objectivists in that club, other than John, that introduced me to the philosophy, piqued my interest. And once I read it, there was no turning back. So that's awesome. How I got introduced to it. And then becoming an attorney, that was something I did later in life. I was the midlife career switch. And when I pitched myself to you, it was that incident that was kind of like the catalyst for me getting respectable and finally getting my license. And that was the unpunished murder of my now partner's late husband. My partner Siobhan was married to.
Hold on one second, because I definitely want to get to that. But so what type of law do you practice? Criminal law, civil law?
I'm a little bit of everything, but mostly civil side. I haven't done any criminal work outside of my advocacy for my partner, which I'm sure we'll discuss. I would like to help productive people be more productive and keep them out of trouble, and that's kind of my angle. So I'll do anything. I'll do a lot, but the goal is, how do I help people be their best? How do I help entrepreneurs? How do I help people like that organize their affairs. So anything from incorporation to writing a goodwill, I will help you with as best I can.
So the
And
type
that's
of
kind of what I
law
do.
you've been dealing with is basically civil law, public law that affects everybody. But the case that you really want to discuss has to do with military law, correct?
That's right. That's right. That's right. This was a slaying of an army officer by a subordinate in 2005.
It was in
And
Tikrit, correct? Tikrit,
that's right,
Iraq.
decreed Iraq.
Okay, so take
And
us to Tikrit. Take us back to that and explain to us your connection to the incident.
sure, sure, sure. Well, it's one of those things where you can do it quickly or you can take 5 hours. But the standing on one foot story was in 2008. I got a phone call from a friend who said, "Are you good with kids?" And yeah, I'm good with kids. Why wouldn't I be? And well, I have a friend who has to attend the murder trial of her husband's killer, and she needs someone to watch her daughter so she can go from Virginia to North Carolina where the trial was being held. So you would have this girl during the day, during the week, and then she'd come home on the weekends, and you'd be all set. And like it was the quickest decision I ever made. I could do this. I could help them, is what I thought. Oh, I'd be good at this. And so the girl was 4 years old, just about to turn five, cutest little thing you ever saw. And my job was to keep her in a good place while mommy was in North Carolina in the trial of her life, basically as the government confronted her husband's accused killer. Philip, her husband, was a army captain, and he was in charge of a very large unit, a National Guard unit. He was called the headquarters commandant. So imagine someone whose job is to make sure that the unit is running well. He's not the overall commander, but he's kind of the guy who makes sure that these guys have their band-aids, and these guys have their food, and these guys have their ammo, and the trucks have gas. He's coordinating all that. Philip had a supply sergeant who was a professional National Guard member who was not very good at his job. And the going from peacetime to full-fledged operations in Iraq was more than this individual could handle, intellectually, morally, the whole 9 yards. He wasn't a particularly bright light. This guy lost equipment, lost sensitive equipment, couldn't keep track of his stuff. That's a huge scandal. Philip, after trying to rehabilitate this guy, train him, get him up to speed, decides this isn't going anywhere. I'm going to have to relieve him for cause. I'm going to have to fire him. Rather than accept being fired like a man, this individual put a landmine in Philip's office at night, detonated it, murdering Philip and another soldier, and then he threw grenades, all to make this look like an Iraqi insurgent attack. And that held for about 12 hours. But as investigators looked at the scene, they realized that, like if it was a mortar attack, when a mortar shell explodes, the metal is like lacerated, torn bits of metal. But they're looking inside Philip's office and they see little BB pockmarks. It's a different weapon. And what they figured out was that this was a Claymore mine, a small, about that size, 3 or 4 pounds of explosive, and 700-800 ball bearings. You put it in the window, had a little clacker, set it off, boom, Philip gets struck down. The other victim, his name was Lou Allen. Philip had brought him from the States to help him solve this problem with supply in his unit. Lou was the father of 4. Philip died almost instantly. Lou took about 6 hours, but his injuries were so severe. I mean, they're point blank to this massive deadly explosion that's lethal, up to 150 yards, and it's right in their faces. It was a foregone conclusion.
Okay,
And
so you're a Marine, right? So
that's I was 5 years in the Marine Corps. That's
yeah,
right.
you're a Marine. So does this type of thing, I don't mean the murder. I mean, obviously that's a unique thing, but do conflicts like this in the military where somebody has to be disciplined or fired for incompetence or for not doing their job, is this the type of thing that happens regularly or is it rare?
I think that's a tough question. I think it's rare. And I think that there are cultural mores that check it before it rises to
Okay.
the red zone level. Like, for example, in this case, the killer's name's Alberto Martinez, and he's passed away, so we can talk about him freely without having to worry about libel. And do recognize that when I make statements out the case, it's what I believe based on my explanation or my examination. But
Yes, I know
recognize,
nothing
like,
about the guy, and like you said, to be
you
clear,
know,
he was
you'll say,
found
"Oh,
not
this guy,
guilty.
he did it," or
No,
it would take more for you to be able to. So I'm just telling you what I.
yes, he was found not guilty.
He was found not guilty.
Okay,
And that again
we're
goes
gonna get to
to,
that for sure.
oh, Nelly. Martinez told anybody who would listen that he had it in for Philip. So he's fuckity him. He better watch out. He doesn't know who he's messing with. He announced his anger quite clearly, and the people in that unit horrifically shrugged it off. And that's not supposed to be. Philip was an officer, and any it's a military is a hierarchical structure organization. So there has to be a certain respect. You might think that the person above you, your superior, is a flaming idiot, but you still have a certain decorum, a certain respect for the mandate that they've been given to lead.
Yeah.
And we're all in the military expected to uphold that ethos. The standard you walk by is the standard that you accept. So the fact that people tolerated Martinez's threats, tolerated his abuse before it rose to the level of murder is a problem. Because, it should have been, "Hey, staff sergeant, that's not how we talk. Hey, staff sergeant, okay, I see you're upset. You look really angry. Yeah, this is affecting you personally, but that's not how we are. Let's go over here and let's figure a way to solve this problem." That didn't happen at the level that it needed to happen. And I think that there's, the act of murder that I believe Martinez committed and the culture that permitted it.
So you're saying
And
basically there's a culture of neglect or indifference or both.
there was in that unit. And it's interesting. I mean, nobody wakes up thinking, he's probably going to commit murder. Well, I mean, maybe if it's they're really very clear that they're red zone, but it's like too horrific an act to contemplate that someone would ever take it that far.
Yeah.
But again, you can see the intermediate steps. And Martinez was certainly showing those intermediate steps. Now, the accusation that I get is, well, you're just saying that from the position of hindsight. And hindsight's 2020. And I would argue, well, hindsight is 2020, so why not use it? And if you want to protect people, if you want to uphold your standards, you should see when your standards are being attacked and eroded. And again, I think the great phrase is the standard you walk by is the standard that you accept. The idea that if you tolerate something without saying anything, that becomes the standard. And in Martinez's case, when you look at the trial records as I have, it's just abundantly clear that he was in a very dark, angry place, and that Philip needed support. And this is where I think objectivism really helped me.
Hold on one second. I'll let you get that. But were there psychological issues or psychological problems with this guy, Martinez? Like, were there things independent even of this that they knew that should have been being looked at?
He should not have been in the Guard, in my opinion. I think that what it was he had a relative who was a command sergeant major, and his relative pulled strings. But you look at his past, he was always petty little crimes. Like, he was a UPS driver, and apparently he had a scam with Beanie Babies where they would declare the package lost, get the insurance settlement, and then resell them or something. Like, he had all these petty little things. His home mysteriously burned down, and again, none of it you could exactly point your finger at and say, well, there you go, there's your red flag.
Okay.
But there was still, it took him a lot of retests on the standard intelligence test to get waived in at a lower standard. So I think he got in based on relaxed standards, and he got tolerated based on relaxed standards, differing standards. One was for intelligence and a background check, and the other was just, respect for a senior authority. But a lot of relaxed standards gave him license, gave him freedom of action that he might not have had the unit been more disciplined. And my partner's quite adamant, like, this unit should have gone to war. Well, it's a big unit. I mean, it's going to war. But the idea was that you need competent, qualified people to function in an extreme environment, and this was not your guy. In peacetime, he was in a one room, little tiny place, building model airplanes or something like that, not really working very hard. And all of a sudden, this unit's mobilizing. It's going to war. It's issuing gear, millions of dollars of gear, and he can't keep track. And the machine's broken, and he doesn't understand how the computer works, and all these problems. He's in over his head. And what I was alluding to before was Philip. Philip was your quintessential Boy Scout. Like if I could ever say that I've seen hatred of the good for being good, it's what happened to Philip.
Okay.
Because Philip was just that guy. And I'm blown away by how he was just that guy. Like, honest to a fault, hardworking to a fault. He was a Boy Scout, Eagle. He was West Point. He was this guy. And then he goes to this unit. They don't like him. He's the outsider. He's the nerd. What's his problem? We're all relaxed. We're all comfortable with ourselves. And here comes this guy, straight-laced.
It's interesting that you say that, because I've seen that dynamic occur so many times. I've seen it with myself, with joining a program in prison, for instance, where they don't really care about the standards that they're supposed to be upholding. I do, so I become the bad guy. I've seen it happen with inmates in prison who wanted to work hard and do a good job, and everybody hates them for doing it. Maybe a correctional officer gets the new job and he wants to actually go by the rules and regulations, and everybody hates him. So that's a common,
that tall poppy, and the tall poppy has to get cut, because and you can't have him.
You were going to say something about the applicability of objectivism to this situation. Is that what you were talking about? This sort of dynamic of envy that is occurring?
I think so. They would never frame it as envy. They don't see themselves as envious. I see it like, oh my God. And I think it's just because Philip was that exceptionally moral, decent human being, and that's resented in our culture today. His persona is non grata in our culture, and in that culture specifically. And what's horrific is it's the military. You think the military would be quite the opposite. But this was an institution with big problems. And it was funny. One of the prosecutors I actually went to undergrad with, and so I'm like, he didn't bring it to trial. He ended up having to go somewhere else. But I recognized the name, like, so I call him up, and we had lunch to discuss the case. And he's like, I've never seen a more lethargic, demotivated unit than this one. And I thought that was telling, listen to what people tell you. And so I took it at face value. Like, there's something to this unit that led to this toxic environment.
So up until the time of the murder, there's red flags occurring. There's a cultural failure. And given that it's a government organization, it's ultimately government failure that led to this man's death, right? You've got all these things occurring, and this guy ends up dead. So after the murder, eventually this guy, Martinez, gets charged.
That's right.
So
pretty quickly.
Yeah. And now you, at the point you started the story, you had agreed to babysit.
That's right. The slaying was in 2005, June of 2005. I came on the scene in 2008.
Okay.
And again, got asked to watch this very cute little girl.
And up until that point, what was it? Just preliminaries that you're normal? Like, I don't know about military preliminaries court.
Because this was a capital murder case. You have two victims, time of war. Death is an option. Death is a potential punishment. So when that happens, everything gets troubled. Everything gets elevated. So there were two preliminary hearings. It took a long time to bring the case to trial. There was an evidentiary dispute. So Martinez was a suspect, but they're still formulating their probable cause. They bring him in for questioning. It was like a quasi-arrest. I don't remember exactly every detail, but suffice it to say, a statement that he had made got excluded. And on appeal, it was a unanimous decision. The evidence was inadmissible. It was a written statement. Okay. But that took a lot of time to resolve. So now it comes to 2008, and it's the trial. And it took about 3 months. I started watching Madeline in early October and it ended in December. And I'm laser focused on Madeline. Like, watching this little girl is a lot because she's lost her dad. She doesn't know how he was murdered, but a 4-year-old can read the room.
Yeah.
And they can
Something's
sense what's
amiss.
going on. They sense the emotions and everything like that. She's separated from her mother. I got to keep her moving. I got to keep her busy. I got to keep her in a healthy spot. And so that was my job. So, I'd take her to school, I'd pick her up, and it was adventures and everything. But at the same time, I got to put her to bed. And when you start to slow down, that's when all the thoughts start percolating. And so I'm getting, where do we go when we die? Why can't my daddy's dead? Can you bring him back? I mean, can you dig him up? I got asked if I could dig him up so she could see him. I mean, she didn't know that he'd been murdered, but she knew that he was this presence. And again, Philip was the marble man, and passionately loved by everybody in his life who meant something to him. So she's picking up on that. And so I'm working with Siobhan to get her in the right place. We're going to therapy every week. And I'm part of the therapy process. And I'm glad to say, that part of it, we got through. Like, Madeline ended up doing pretty well in the face of it. And it was a lot of work, but, it kind of became my passion. And in this process of keeping an eye on Madeline, I kind of discovered Siobhan as this beautiful woman who was, wonderful in her own right. And I can say, I'm a failed nanny, and we have a son together, and live very happily and are, looking forward. But during this process, it's all going on. I'm not paying full attention to the trial, but it's in the background. Like, every day I would talk to Siobhan at the end of the day, and I'd get a little bit of what's going on. But my spidey sense is not tingling that this is going to end badly. Like, I mean, why would they convict him? They have the evidence. There's so much evidence. Like, what, So I'm, again, focused on Madeline. I get the phone call. Nick, head home, put the alarm on. They acquitted him. And I'm just gobsmacked. Like, how? Why? What? And that became kind of the order of the day, to answer those questions. How did this happen? Why? What explains it? And it's something that, I'll probably never be able to get my finger completely on it, because, let's face it, the jury doesn't have a whole lot of incentive to talk to me, because all I would be doing would be questioning their decision.
Sure.
But as I understand it, the majority of the panel wanted to convict, and military law is a little bit different. You don't require, military law doesn't require a unanimous jury. They require, at one point it was 2/3. Now I think it's 3/4. It's a moving target, and I'd have to refresh myself on exactly what it is now. But you don't require anonymity. And so what that means is there's one vote. And apparently the legend has it that they were one vote shy of a conviction. And the question was, well, why were there these holdouts? And as far as I can ascertain, it's because some of the panel members were opposed to death as a potential sentence. And now these trials are 2 phases. You have a guilt and innocence phase, which is binary: guilty, innocent. And then you have a punishment phase.
Yeah.
And a punishment phase one panel member could say, I don't think death's appropriate here, and veto a death sentence. That's how it all works. And it makes a certain sense. The Supreme Court decision, I forget the decision, but the view was, when you're answering a question of life and death, you should side towards being very conservative in applying death as a punishment. So if somebody's spidey sense is tingling, I don't think that death's appropriate here, that should be enough. And I get that. I get that. I think what the jury did was they didn't understand their instructions. So they did some of the panel members did a strategic not guilty vote in order to spare him from death. And if that's true, and again, I've only gotten this secondhand, so I could be completely wrong.
Yeah.
But if that's true, it's basically a panel member substituting their whim for the law.
Sure.
And they're briefed on the law. Now, I've looked at the instructions, and I think they could be refined. I think they could be made more clear. But what I see is panel members substituting their whim for the law. And what makes it horrific is these are soldiers who've taken an oath to uphold the law.
Sure.
And again, I probably like you and I'm sure that there are lots of laws we disagree with, but I think we would both agree as objectivists that we need a rule of law in order to handle
Sure.
these problems.
Sure.
So, if I'm asked to be a panel member on a jury member on an antitrust trial, I'm probably going to get struck because I just think antitrust is absurd. But should there be a rule of law, and antitrust is currently part of that, and we can, attack the margins? Absolutely. I think if you do what these jurors did,
Well, jury nullification for murder is a bit much, but that call, but that,
but at the same time, you could see where a jury nullification, it's a little more complicated. That's where it gets weird. Well, and that's why I'm so excited to talk to you.
But
because I'm sure you bring a perspective.
But this is kind of, I mean, not kind of. This is speculative. We don't ultimately know why they acquitted the guy, right? We don't know for certain. But what we do know for certain is that he offered to plead guilty prior to trial.
That's exactly right. And this is, again, where it gets weird because his attorneys are supposed to believe that his plea offer is true. So if he admits guilt, they have to believe, they're supposed to believe it. And yet it comes around, the government rejects the plea offer. And I could see why the government rejected it, because it was he was pleading to second-degree murder, and this was a first-degree murder case. Like it takes effort to put a landmine and roll. Well,
hold on, but he was willing to accept life in prison with the possibility of parole after 10 years, but that's no guarantee you're going to get parole.
I think when I spoke with the prosecutors about it, they thought that the threat of parole was too high, and they thought they had a solid enough case.
Okay. Was there familial pressure on the prosecutor to not accept that plea?
The widows didn't even know about it. That's where insult, so they didn't even know that it was on the table. They didn't find out until after the trial. And then it was like, oh, well, by the way, there was this offer. I'm like, what?
So either the prosecution had a very strong case that the jury ignored for some reason, or it was prosecutorial arrogance. And this doesn't speak to anything of the guilt or innocence of the guy. Like I said, I don't know. I haven't looked at the details, but I do know that he offered to plead guilty. So if I'm a prosecutor and I'm looking at this guy and he says to me, I'm going to plead guilty, I'll take life in prison, I can say to myself, okay, I know when I take this guy to trial, I'm going to smoke him. He's not going to be acquitted, right? In order for me to turn down that plea, I've got to be confident I'm going to get him. So either that confidence was based on his knowledge of the law and the facts of the case. In that case, it's the jury that's, acted irresponsibly, or it's arrogance and he was just wrong about the strength of the case. So what do you think?
Yeah.
So what do you think after looking at if you've looked at the evidence? Because I haven't. What do you think?
I've read the transcript. I've studied it. And also, I've looked at things after the fact. So I kind of looked at a bigger picture than what the jurors got to see. Like, I do know about the plea offer. I do know about his actions once he was acquitted. And, so I have I have a wider lens to look at these things. I think he's our guy. I think that the government proved its case. I think that their performance, the prosecution's performance at trial, could certainly be improved upon. I think that they called some rebuttal witnesses that weren't the strongest witnesses. I think that, like, for example, you just get these cues when you read the record where the judge is asking a prosecutor to speak up. What? I mean, if you want to show, just like you said, if you believe in your case, it shows by the way you carry yourself.
Sure.
You're a soldier. You definitely, you shouldn't be a big ass to like sound confident, sound like you mean it, talk with authority. And so if you're getting these subtle cues that someone's being asked to like speak up repeatedly, or someone's having a hissy fit in front of the judge, and these trials, one thing that I got, which was interesting, I'm reading the trial and there were parts where I felt bad for Martinez's legal team, where I'm like, wow, he's really ripping him. And that would be grueling. Like, I wouldn't want to get dressed down that way. And I thought that was interesting. Like, I'm feeling sorry for my opponent's defenders. It was a tough trial. It was a tough, demanding trial with a work all day load and then briefing issues and coming back in the morning and doing it all over again. So, I mean, I think that, you could see fatigue setting in and whatnot. And you could see people's nerves being frayed. So I could see it's tough to maintain your discipline and your bearing in a very stressful situation. At the same time, you're trained to be a professional. You are a professional. And so I think that the prosecution, I think they would freely admit that they could have improved upon their performance. At the same time, I do hold the jurors responsible, because I think that justice is a slow, deliberative, difficult process. And it requires you to really evaluate a whole bunch of spinning plates in order to try and arrive at the truth, in order to try to arrive at what a person deserves. What did Ayn Rand say? Justice is to give a person what they deserve, with human life as the standard of value. I absolutely agree with that definition. That requires tremendous effort. And I think culturally, when I look at American juries, I don't see them expending that effort. I don't feel good about it. I think that, again, it's a lot of whim worship. I think that, the police are always liars, or the police are always right, or whatever like that, or, just a very rigid thought process that's myopic and pragmatic and unprincipled. And then when it's confronted with because a case that goes to trial is not by definition an easy case. Easy case is settled. So at some point, you're going to have to fight it out and make a tough call. And tough calls take effort. And tough calls should be animated by sound principles. And I think, in the case of Martinez murdering Philip and Lou, there are so many lines that point to Martinez.
What were Philip and Lou's last names? I don't know if I asked you already.
Philip Esposito and Lou Allen.
Okay, I want to just make sure. So if anybody wants to go look it up, this information is all available.
What are you talking about?
So, Nicholas, this seems to me that however we look at this, right, post-murder, before murder, there may very well be a breakdown. I ultimately don't know, but from the way you described it, there was a breakdown in the system. But post-murder, it seems to me we can't escape the fact that there's some breakdown. For instance, let's say this guy Martinez was innocent. If he was innocent and offering to plead guilty to take a life in prison with parole after 10 years, that's a breakdown, that an innocent guy is willing to prove guilty. If he's guilty, on the other hand, there's a breakdown somewhere. I don't know where, whether it be the prosecution's not accepting the plea, or if it's the jury ignoring the law. Somewhere something broke down. And I think that to me is the message that comes out of this is, no matter how you look at it, whether you believe the guy's innocent, guilty, whatever, something broke down here. Is that fair to say?
You're absolutely right. And I think you're onto it. There could be a strategic reason why an innocent person would plead guilty, and that's because he wants to save his life.
Sure.
So if you have a system that tolerates that, that's a broken system, because the stakes it's cruel.
Yeah, you're putting an innocent person behind bars. Sure.
One could argue that there should be no pleas at all in a case of that magnitude, because there could be a perverse incentive for a person to plead strategically to accept the punishment that they don't deserve.
Especially with the disparity.
I certainly would not have a problem with holding the government's feet to the fire.
I'll tell you, Nicholas, I just want to tell you something, and I do this. I interrupt. I'm sorry, but I got to get this out before I forget. When I went to trial, I was originally offered 26 suspended after 16. I refused it. I was then offered 18 flat. I refused it. I went to trial. I was acquitted of the most serious charges. Now, full disclosure, I was guilty of the most serious charges. I just happened to be acquitted of them. I'm not claiming innocence or injustice or anything. Right. I just wanted to demonstrate so the audience understands what happens here. So I'm offered 18 years, and one of the crimes was 2 counts of first-degree assault. I was acquitted of both counts of first-degree assault, but I was convicted of other charges: conspiracy and accessory to burglary. I don't want to go through the whole list.
Right. No, I read your case. So,
okay, but I got 27 years. So even though I got acquitted of the most serious charges, I was given 9 more years because I chose to go to trial. The point being that everybody that goes into a courtroom, every criminal defendant understands that if you don't take the plea deal, you're going to be significantly punished for going to trial, even if you're acquitted of some of the charges. And that gives the perverse incentive that you're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, it's a classic prisoner's dilemma where you're punished for acting in your best, what you perceive to be your best interest. People will argue. I've heard people argue to me that, well, we just couldn't afford taking every case and bringing it to trial. And that was one of the arguments in this death penalty case cost the government millions of dollars. And, we just can't do that all the time. And my view is, kind of, justice costs what justice costs. And
maybe if they got rid of some unjust laws, they wouldn't have to worry about
you could
all
start
those
that would be a good start. I think,
like the war on drugs that you started with earlier with your debate.
Hey, and whatnot. Yeah, I mean, holding the state to its burden. The king is not above the law, and holding the state to its burden ought not to be something that you pay with a decade of your life. And so, yeah, I would agree with you that's evidence of a big problem. And again, the king is not above the law. It goes back to Magna Carta. Yeah, I read your case, and it was fascinating, and it's fascinating to hear this. And part of my training was law and econ, law and economics, and the idea of economic decision making in questions of justice. And yeah, I mean, you're faced with a very vexing problem, and you suffered for it. And at the same time,
it's funny you talk about that, because I did make it. I was 21 years old, but the calculation I made was simple. I knew they didn't have evidence to prove the first-degree assault.
Right.
I knew I was guilty of it, but I knew they couldn't prove it. And because I knew they couldn't prove it, I said, well, I'll go and I'll beat that. I'll get acquitted of it. And it ended up costing me. Now, it's easy to say, well, you were guilty, you deserved the long sentence. Fine, I'll accept that. That is justice, getting what you deserve. But in a broader societal sense, it's not a good thing when people know that exercising their right to a trial is going to cost them. That's not a good thing.
I mean, there are countless law review articles on that very subject.
Sure.
And I would agree with you. And I again, what do you want? You want a fair process, and you want the right punishment for the right reasons. And also, what I think is interesting about your case, and this, from my perspective, this remarkable transformation that you've worked on and are probably still working on.
Sure.
Is what's the best catalyst for someone with that ambition? Someone who's okay. On one hand, you freely admit you committed a crime; it was heinous. But now, 25 some years later, you want to be a better man.
Yeah.
And what I think is interesting is you point out quite clearly that the system is not equipped to help you, and it has a lot of perverse incentives to stop that. And I saw, so I got my copy of Inside the Criminal Mind.
Great book.
And you spoke with him, and I find that so fascinating. If you're going to impose a sentence where the person will eventually be released, rehabilitation ought to be a substantial priority.
Sure.
Now, what I wanted to ask you from your perspective was, okay, so same now and Inside the Criminal Mind, which I heartily recommend, and I'm sure you do too, that anybody with an interest in justice read this book.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Because I wanted to understand. I mean, to me, Martinez's actions seem so inexplicable because they were so nakedly against his interest. You murder two men who were good men. You've just declared war on humanity. People are going to want to see you suffer.
Sure.
And rightfully so. They're not going to want to deal with you. They're going to want to see retribution. They're going to want to see punishment. They're going to want to see justice. Unless he thought that he was this master criminal who could just get away with it, and it certainly was a cover-up.
Why would you
declare that war?
Here's why. When you read the Inside the Criminal Mind is by Dr. Samenow, but Dr. Samenow and Dr. Samuel Yolkelson wrote a 3-volume set called The Criminal Personality, where they lay out 52 criminal thinking errors that us criminals commit out of habit. It's just our natural way of thinking. I don't want to say natural because it implies some kind of innate born with thing, but it's what we do par for the course. It's our thinking. One of the thinking errors that they point out is super optimism, whereby we think we're going to get away with everything. We think we're smarter than everybody. We think we're clever and no one's going to catch us. When I was 18, I was in a school for troubled kids, and I had a conversation with my therapist, as was required as an attendee of the school. Years later, when I was being processed into the prison psychologist read to me my high school therapist's comments. And what she said was, Michael continues to engage in illegal activity and believes he will not get caught. The irony, of course, is now I'm sitting in prison listening to this. The thing is part of that super optimism is justified by the fact that we know we get away with the vast majority of the crimes we commit.
Right.
So from a pure probabilistic viewpoint, if I look at a criminal's career trajectory, I say, okay, he's committing these many crimes. He's going to get caught eventually. The problem is each crime you commit, the likelihood is you're going to get away with it. And so that's what leads to that type of arrogance. He likely got away, assuming I don't want to assume anything. Somebody in that position that commits a serious crime, he's likely gotten away with many, many crimes before. And that would explain that dynamic.
That's part of the backstory that I've observed, is that he had, again, low level, but then.
Sure. Now, before we go, I don't want to leave on a down note. I mean, you've got a good relationship you're with your partner. You guys are doing well. So can you tell us a little bit about that? Just to put a cap on it. How's your story turning out? It's not ended. You're still breathing, but
Right. I just think that Siobhan is one of the strongest women that I'll ever know. And that is that she took a gut punch with Philip's murder. She fought as valiantly as a victim can fight. And when she reached a point where it wasn't making her happy, she decided, I'm going to commit to looking more forward than back. And so I think out of the universe of people I know who've been affected by tragedy, she's the strongest, most remarkable person in that regard, and most mentally disciplined in that regard, where she's just, it's a dark place. If I dwell on it, it only makes me miserable, and I want to be happy. And that was something, where Ayn Rand definitely impacted my thinking, because I remember, like, the day after the verdict, and the family is all at Siobhan's house, and everybody's just shocked. Madeline's playing, she's fine, she's in her own world, but all the adults are just, they can't fathom what happened.
Yeah.
And I remember sitting down with Siobhan, and it was a conversation that was like, well, what are we going to do now? And it was twofold. There's the criminal justice system, that form of justice, and you've lost, and there's no more fighting it. But then there's the court of public opinion, and we can make that boy glow, and we can let the world know these are the facts, and this is what happened, and so people know this is this man's character. And I think we succeeded in large part there, because there were a couple subtle interactions where you got to see he wasn't appreciating things that we were saying. And like, his wife visited Siobhan's blog and left a message, and I only found out about it until after everybody died. He's died, his wife died, but then I was able to put together all the pieces, like, oh, that was her leaving a little remark. How quaint. And the other was, you have the right to be happy, and you can be happy, because when that happened, when that ton of bricks fell on us, like, I was thinking, like, this was a woman that I'd come to love, but we, nice boys don't chase screaming widows. So, I care for her, but give her some space. And I just, like, when are we ever going to get, when will there ever be a point where we could be happy in our own skin? And that just seemed like it was a million miles away, and it wasn't. But at the time, and it was just like, we had this conversation. You have the right to be happy, and you will be happy. It may take time, but you have that. And Siobhan, without a whole lot of, because she's Irish, so she doesn't wear it on her sleeve. But that was her.
You're gonna get us canceled here.
I hope not. I hope not. But one of the things that I was so eager to talk to you, because I've seen the victim side quite clearly as a result of my experience with Siobhan and other victims. Like, when I went to law school, I took a crime victims' rights seminar, and I was required to meet with a member of the community whose daughter had been murdered. And her daughter was 18, and she was shot in the back of the head while pregnant. and it was
Oh,
just some wannabe gangsters who, they were in the local marijuana racket, and they watched one too many rap videos, and they thought this is how it played. Like, let's just go cap a girl. And then, I'd meet other people. One mother, her son had been murdered at a party. Nobody knows nothing. Who was he? Who was there? Who was he interacting with? Nobody sees nothing. Unsolved to this day. And you see these horrific injustices, and you see the impact they leave on people. But you're kind of the other side of that, where you were, as a young man, a certain way, and it wasn't healthy. And yet somehow you're either in the process, or a transformation, or Ayn Rand's ideas were instrumental in that transformation.
sure.
And I always thought in the back of my head, like, you always hear these people, they discover God in prison. I'm like, well, how useless is that? And
Very.
like, well, wouldn't I want to go and pass out Atlas Shrugged? And then I've always been like, well, if I do that and then they get out and they kill somebody, oh, it was I, and so there's always, but you're the exact, you're the one, and you're the one who's advocating for justice reform and correctional reform and whatnot. And I find that incredibly fascinating, this transformation. And again, going from Sam now, it's difficult. He says right out, you can change your thoughts, you can change how you frame yourself in the world.
Yeah.
But it's a Herculean effort, and very few people do it. And I'm intrigued to hear more about that, because I do believe in the power of free will. I do believe in the power of thought and the power to change oneself and remanufacture one's character, even. And so, that's why I'm just so fascinated to hear your story, because that's your story. And
I plan to keep telling it.
Awesome.
But
awesome.
I don't always, it's a fine line. You know what I mean? I don't want to make everything about me. You know what I mean? But at the same time, if people that watch the show or listen to it on, only on the podcast, they'll get a sense of what it is. And the point that you made is about free will is vital, because if we have free will, we're capable of changing. If we're not capable of changing, we don't have free will. It's that simple. And I think we do have free will. I've seen it work. It is a Herculean task, just like he says, but it can happen. People can go through tragedy. People can be horrible people and turn it all around. Your story is a case in point. Out of a tragedy came a wonderful relationship, and now I'm thrilled to hear about that. So
thank you.
Thank you so much for reaching out to me. I found this to be a very good discussion. I've enjoyed talking to you.
Oh, thank you.
Is there some place that you want people to find you? I know they can find you on Facebook, but is there
if I'm on
someplace else?
Facebook, or just Google my name, and I have my firm page. You can always reach me there.
All right.
And I'd be happy to answer any questions or talk to people anytime.
All right. Thanks a lot, Nicholas. I really appreciate
Michael, thank you so much.
Here.
It was a real pleasure.
Yeah.
It was a real
And
treat.
for now, this is the Rational Egoist. I'm Michael Liebowitz signing out. Remember, like, share, comment, subscribe. Till next time.